I'm Geraldine Doogue. Welcome to this video on behalf of CPSL, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Robert Fitzgerald AM to join us. Robert has sat for 5 years as a Commissioner on the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, what we know of as the Royal Commission into Child Abuse. And Robert, 5 years is a long time out of anyone's life. Are you a changed man?
Well, I think so. I think all of the commissioners, the 6 commissioners, are changed in some way or another. But I think for me, it was really an exploration into an area that we really had very little understanding of. So it was one of discovery, but it was also one of change. And some of the preconceptions that I had early in the piece disappeared very, very quickly indeed.
Why are safeguards and real sort of statutory requirements about safeguards, why do they matter?
Well, I think they matter in a couple of ways. Fundamentally, we want to create an institution that thinks and breathes about the safety of children. And it's an institution that acts in the best interests of children or vulnerable people. And to do that, there's a number of things that have to come together. One is there are external pressures, for example, regulations that people have to abide by. There's rules and regulations in relation to civil litigation about, duties of care. But there's also about the internal mechanisms in an organisation that will make it a child safe or not. And one of the big learnings out of the Royal Commission is just because an institution is dealing with children, whether it's a school or a residential care area or a sports club, we can't ever assume that in fact it is acting in the best interests of children. Safeguards actually help organisations to actually create a child-safe environment in a very practical way, from the very top, from the board, as I say, right through to the basement. So safeguarding standards are a way by which organisations and institutions are aided in creating that child-safe environment.
So they can actually encourage and guarantee change, you suggest?
They guarantee change in 2 ways. One is there's going to be external pressures on organisations to change. There will be changes to mandatory reporting for child protection purposes.
That's state imposed?
Yep. There will be changes for mandatory reporting to the police. There will be statutory-based mandatory or minimum standards that will be applied. It already happens in Queensland, South Australia and Victoria. But when you actually look at an institution, how do you actually change the attitude of an institution? How do you change the culture of an institution? And one of the ways you do that is actually change the practices of the institution. And standards, safeguards, are all about the practical manifestation of a mindset that says we want to keep children safe in this institution. And these are the means by which we can achieve that.
And of course, in this situation, there's going to be an audit process as well, isn't there? And then a public reporting. So it's fundamentally about transparency, I suppose.
One of the greatest problems for religious institutions has been the failure of transparency. The single greatest failure of the Catholic Church and others was a culture that in fact didn't want to be transparent. Everything was done secretly. It wasn't only to the public, it was to the people of the churches themselves. Even their own clergy were kept in the dark about the extent of the abuse. And so one of the things going forward is that we need a culture in institutions generally, and churches in particular, that actually embraces transparency. Transparency about things that go wrong. Transparency about the responses to those things that have gone wrong, but also transparency about how they're actually going to improve things and fix things. And that's a very different mindset for institutions that have traditionally been private, secretive, and believing that the less people know, the better it is. So this is a very big change.
How is it going to not be just a box-ticking exercise? Because after all, that's in the Royal Commission on Banking at the moment. And secondly, how do you stop it becoming a punitive exercise? You've been naughty people and we're going to really punish you.
The very first standard, both in terms of the Catholic Church but more generally, is about governance, leadership and culture. And it's actually about the cultural change that's necessary in these institutions. And that's one that actually says this isn't about compliance. It isn't about a set of rules and regulations. It's about a way in which an organisation thinks, acts, reacts to these situations. And the standards are simply a means by which that can occur. But there does have to be consequences, both in terms of failure to implement the standards, or in fact when things go wrong and the standards aren't actually followed. And so auditing is very important. The biggest problem for the church and churches generally, and for institutions, is a betrayal of trust or a loss of trust in the community. How will that be restored? And one of the ways it'll be restored is by people being able to actually see that these standards, these safeguards have not only been adopted, but actually the institution's prepared to be publicly accountable. Now that's a huge step forward for many of the institutions. If that occurs, it will have an internal benefit. The organisation will actually change, but also the community can actually say, yeah, these organisations are fair income about this. And that's why it's so important that there are auditing processes, and it's so important that those audits are made public, not only for the church but more generally.
What's the best way, in your view, exactly at this point where we are, where people who are inside the church who want to create these new institutions you're describing, how can they approach their task?
Well, I think the first thing is to accept the evidence. It's very important that institutions accept the truth of what has been revealed by victims and survivors. 8,000 in those private sessions came forward and they told their stories. And those stories deserve to be heard, listened to and acted upon. We've seen the case studies demonstrate the failures from culture right through to processes and procedures. So it's firstly accept the evidence. The second thing is the want to have the will to change. To actually say, yes, we can have a healthy church. We can have a safe church. And in fact, we, the people, want that to happen. The third thing is to implement practical measures. And that does affect many aspects of church life, right from the selection of our leaders, the governance structures, the way in which people are trained and formed, and then right through to the way in which local settings, local organisations such as parishes or schools are actually managed and operated.
But what I hear from you, in a sense, is that even if you feel you are confident about your organisation, I think what you're saying, tell me if I'm wrong, that these new safeguards offer a whole new model, a constructive model of church for the future. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, absolutely. And the reasons for that are that they're multidimensional. Firstly, they go to the leadership and governance of an institution. They go to the way in which those institutions actually engage with families. They go to the way in which institutions talk to and engage with children. They go to the way in which all personnel, wherever they are, whether they're bishops, clergy, religious or lay people, are formed, trained, supervised over the life of their activity in the church. It's a very different way of doing business. It's not simply ticking boxes. It's actually a different way of organising yourself and then interacting with those, especially children, family members, parishioners and the community as a whole.
But I don't know that I fully understand how differently it could be done in many cases. I thought that a lot of the schools that I know about do have children at the centre of their function and their purpose.
So when we did the case studies on schools, both private schools and state schools, what did we see? We saw that many of the schools actually had policies and procedures. But what then didn't happen is, when there was a crisis, when something went wrong, they did what most people do. They applied their own personal views. So what happens is, as soon as a teacher, a priest, even a family member is accused, four things happen. The first is they say, it couldn't possibly be so. I know that person, they couldn't possibly have done it. The second group say, oh, it's the victim. They're always making these stories up. The child can't be trusted. The third is somebody will say, well, he was always acting a bit odd, a bit different. And the fourth one says they're absolutely guilty. And the interesting phenomenon with that is that affects the way in which you deal with the matter. What these safeguards and standards do is say it doesn't matter what you think. It says if this has occurred and there's a reasonable plausibility behind it, this is what you have to do. And that gives safety to the institution. But the biggest
strips the emotion out of it.
The biggest problem in the institutions is the emotional side. And in the church, there was an assumption that priests could not do any wrong. And that assumption was so strong that even family members would not believe their own children, wouldn't believe them for years and years, despite the mounting evidence. Now, that was also true inside church. We see that in schools, we see that in childcare centres, we see it in sporting groups. The famous coach, that person stands in awe, and as soon as there's a complaint, instead of saying, okay, we'll now investigate that, deal with it in an appropriate way, support the person bringing the allegation, as well as support the person that's been accused, they immediately take a personalised approach. Now, standards and safeguard help you not do that. And that's why mandatory reporting is so important. Mandatory reporting is about saying, it doesn't matter what you think, Geraldine or Robert. It's actually, if this occurs, this is what you're required to do.
Do you think they'll be oppressive?
They can be oppressive. And the guidance from the Royal Commission was that in relation to child safe standards, they should be principles-based, that they should be, the compliance by the state governments in this case, and the institutions, has to be proportionate to the nature of the risk and the nature of the organisation itself. So there's a very different way of applying these standards, for example, to a sporting club who's operating in the community than it will be to a school. And equally within church, there'll be elements of church where a fairly prescriptive approach might be more necessary, in others where it's not going to be necessary at all. So the great danger is to turn it into either a tick and flick exercise, which has no value, or it's seen as a compliance burden. What we aim to do is to say that these are actually an aid and assistance to institutions. And if you follow the 10 standards, if you follow the processes that are associated with those, I think that they'll actually be a source of great help. The other thing about them, but they do require to be engaged with the stakeholders, family members, parishioners, children. These are not just for staff. This is about the way the institution engages more generally. And I think that will be enormously beneficial. I can't remember in all my years in the Catholic Church anybody ever talking about these issues, you know, and that now will have to change. But it will change for the better.
I think this was a really challenging thing for a lot of us looking on. How could the Church constructively contribute to healing so that people weren't seen to be stuck, which was such a message of despair? I rather felt the media emphasised that notion that you could never recover, which I thought was a terrible message.
Well, you can recover, but the victims and survivors of sexual abuse, particularly within faith-based organisations, require 3 or 4 things. One is acknowledgement. That is an absolute statement that we believe the truth of what's been revealed. Not Mickey Mousing around this stuff. That's what it is, and the extent is extensive. The second thing is they want redress. They want the Church to be involved in those redress processes that the national government has spoken about. The third thing is that they actually want acknowledgement that there will be change in the Church itself. And that's part of this safeguarding approach. It's actually a demonstration that we've listened and we've acted, and we're serious about it. We're fair dinkum about this. And the fourth part is some of them do want healing. Now some don't. Some don't want anything to do with the Church at all. But many of the people that I spoke to in private sessions actually do, and they're open to it. The question is whether the Church and other religious institutions are opening to that area. And healing is about not forcing people into a process, but rather being open to them coming forward, listening to what they want and responding to what they say.
I mean, if the Church can't offer some sort of hope, you wonder what it's on the planet for, don't you? But it's almost as if to offer hope is seen these days to be that you feel that you're exonerating yourself. I can't see that that's the case.
Well, one of the things that happens to a victim or a survivor is the loss of hope. And part of the reason why the Royal Commission was important for those people is that many of them said to us at the end of those private sessions that it in fact given them back hope. Hope because they were starting to be believed. Hope because they could see the community actually acknowledging their issues. And actually hope that the institutions which they had come to hate actually were responding. The second thing is there's hope within the institutions. And, you know, people said to us, you know, the Catholic Church and others shouldn't be allowed to run schools and that. No, that's not going to happen. These churches and institutions are an important part of the fabric of our country and our nation, and they will continue to exist. The question is, how will they exist and what sort of churches they'll be? And if I can just put it this way, I think what's happening in many of the organisations, it's like a grief process. The church that they once knew no longer exists. The leaders that they once trusted have been seen to be flawed. Some of the things that they believed in have now been called into question, their own vocations. So you can stay in grief for the rest of your life if you wish to, or you can move forward from that. And what's required for the Church is to move through this grief, for priests and bishops and religious and laity to recognise that this is like a grieving process, and at the end to have something that is healthier, safer and frankly a better place, not only for children but for the community of believers or the community of faithful. Now that's the process we're in. So the pain that people are suffering and expressing, both priests and bishops and religious in particular, I understand. But grief is something that one will have to work through. And I think the Royal Commission in a strange way provides a way forward. The safeguards and the standards, I think, are a practical way forward. And I believe that actually there is hope within those institutions.
So let's just look at leadership then and what the community might see from here on in of church leaders if all of these standards are applied and your hopes are realised. What do you think leadership will look like?
Well, the first thing about leadership, it's related to the governance structures as well as the culture. So the leadership we've talked about in the Royal Commission is a leadership, firstly, where the leaders are selected after a much greater engagement with the people over whom they have leadership responsibilities. It's about selecting leaders that have an attentiveness to these particular issues. It's a leadership that is properly trained in the running of these organisations, having regard to these sorts of issues. It's a leadership that actually engages with people, simply doesn't want to lead for people, but leads with people. And hence the standards are all about talking to families, talking about community members, talking about children. It's quite a different style of leadership, but it's absolutely about one that's engaged not only with the issue, but with the people that are affected by it. And in some institutions that will be easy. They're very democratic in processes and they're very engaged. For others, that'll be a much more difficult challenge. And for the church itself, that will be quite a difficult challenge.
So will we feel a difference then, do you think, ideally, in parish structure?
Absolutely. If we don't feel a difference, then the risks will be there. If I walk into a church today and there is nothing different, there is no sign that this is a safe church, there's no indication of what the policies and procedures are, there's no indication of how a priest or the clergy are meant to act in relation to, say, altar boys and altar girls, if there's nobody that I can easily take a complaint to, if there's no literature there, if there's no communication and a conversation that naturally takes place, if the children themselves aren't provided with any education about these issues, then that will be an unsafe and unhealthy parish. It will be an unsafe and unhealthy church. But if I walk into a parish and I recognise that, yep, they actually do embrace these things. There is an open conversation. I can readily find out what the policies are. The safeguards are readily available to the church-going people. Then we'll start to say, yeah, this is a church, this is a parish that absolutely gets this.
So do you mean, for instance, like just getting down to tin tacks, on your bulletin, there'd be an item on your bulletin about whom you could direct a complaint to?
Absolutely. In fact, one of the parishes that I was in the other day has appointed 2 safeguarding officers. In the Archdiocese of Perth, there are safeguarding officers attached to every parish. There's actually communication out there.
And they're lay people,
but the most important thing is that there's a conversation. Child sexual abuse thrives in an environment where there is secrecy. The perpetrator requires it. The children's vulnerabilities are enhanced by the secrecy of it. How do you break that down? You have a normal conversation about sex, about sexual abuse, in the same way that we talk about workplace safety nowadays, the same way we're starting to talk about bullying, the same way society is starting to talk about domestic and family violence. It's the conversation that is necessary. So in all of these churches, we'll know that things have changed when there can be an open conversation about these issues on an ongoing basis, together with the practical measures. If that conversation doesn't take place, then in fact nothing will change.
So you know that a lot of people there was almost an exhaustion with the degree of this discussion. And I can imagine quite a few people sitting in parishes saying, oh, do we have to have a public conversation about this? I've had enough.
Sure. Well, I understand that. What we understand is that in relation to matters of abuse, including family and domestic violence, it's once it's opened up, it's once the conversation is engaged in by the community that we start to make a change. But what we know even more in child abuse is the children that were abused didn't even understand whether what was happening to them was abuse. They hadn't the words, they didn't have the concepts. For many in the most conservative faith-based organisations, they had no conception about what was happening to them because they were denied normal and proper access to sex education and training. When they raised these matters with their families or other people, they were in total denial. And even today in some of the most conservative faiths around Australia, some of the closed religions and some of the more ethnically based religions, that abuse is being treated the same way. That is, you go home and you tell the family if you've got the words, and the family says to you, don't say anything to anybody else. This will bring shame on the family. It will bring shame on the church. It will bring shame on the community. And by the way, he couldn't possibly do it because he's a great man. Now that's exactly what happened to the Irish Catholics of 30 or 40 years ago. What's changed in the Catholic Church more generally is we're starting to have the conversation. In these other institutions, that conversation has not yet started. And so part of the Royal Commission's work was we ran a number of multicultural forums. And the reason was simply to start the conversation. Unless you have the conversation about sex, unless you have the conversation about abuse more generally, unless you start that conversation with parents and children, the only person that suffers from that is the child. In the past, we said, don't tell anybody because you're going to hurt the family, the church, the community. But you have to suffer. We said, you, of all the people, you've got to hold it back, not tell anybody. Go through your whole life pretending it never happened. Not the adults, not the institutions. We cannot let that happen again.
Final question. How would you now define a child-safe institution?
A child-safe institution is one that thinks and acts in the interests of that child. That is, you ask yourself over and over again, are the decisions we're making, are the actions we're taking in the genuine interests of the child? What we've seen in previous institutions was that there was an assumption. An assumption because we work with children, we are therefore by nature a child-safe institution. And the community believed it. You know, child protection agencies accepted that. And what we've discovered it isn't. The fact that you work with children, you shouldn't assume that you're actually acting in their interest. And so from the boardroom to the basement, from everybody that's involved in that institution, including parents and children, need to be engaged with a single focus, and that is acting in the best interest of children, acting in a safe way. It's about culture, it's about attitude, it's about decision making, and it's about practices and procedures. But ultimately that's the final question. Are we an institution that acts in the best interest of children and their safety?
Surely theologically that can't be wrong.
It can't be wrong, but it gets confused. And the point just there is, I think everybody would have assumed the church would have acted in the best interests of children. And yet at the end of the day, we saw example after example where the reputation of the church, the favouring of people that were known and believed in, took precedence over that. So history is very important if we're going to get the future right.
Robert Fitzgerald, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Pleasure.